Hello, it's Not and welcome to my quick meta guide on the Protection Paladin. The first TBC tank spec to be covered in this series, and actually my first ever raiding spec. Yeah, that's right. A young, enthusiastic Not was seduced by the journey from meme spec to Paladin way back. But very quickly, I'm making these videos as I couldn't find information the way I wanted it on YouTube as a consumer, and so Good Guy Not has taken on the heavy burden to break down each class or spec into what I wanted, and that is essentially first the PvE basics and what 10 seconds or so may look like in a raid encounter. Following this, a brief overview of the race choices available, then I'll move on to what the spec's strengths are and what limitations it has. Finally, I'll cover briefly professions and PvP, but if you want any additional information beyond the broad strokes, you may want a specific guide on these topics. So, with that out of the way, what's our spec looking like for our Prot Paladin? Well, the standard build is 0, 49, 12, but don't worry if you're coming from Classic, Consecration is baseline, so we don't have to worry about all those points not spent in Holy to get our AoE going. The short end of the stick is that there's a few variable points, but largely we're going to stick to Prot as the main source of our points for everything that makes us chunkier, which is a technical term, by the way, in addition to our key Captain America spells, Holy Shield and Avengers Shield. You'll notice right away that we have passed over some solid talents in this tree, and that's simply because there's so many other, slightly better or a lot better talents to pick up. And without going into too much depth, essentially we just need to get chunkier and then allow for as much threat as possible. And before someone scrolls down to the comments after eyeballing 0 out of 5 in Reckoning, "But bro, where's my extra attacks?" Hold up lad, our threat is all spell damage and those extra attacks are pretty wimpy when we're armed with a mage's hand-me-down toy.
What?
Moving on rapidly, once we're in the ret tree, we can take either of our row 1 talents, but typically we're going to take the mana reduction because mana is threat and the other paladin or 2 will probably have improved might covered. For 5 mans you're a hot commodity and when you won't have to stoop to the levels of inviting melee, so honestly improved might really doesn't matter outside of reigns. Hee XD, of course you can choose to take them, but honestly it's charity on your part. We then take the juicy 5% avoidance from deflection and get more judgments per fight with the shorter cooldown. So, we're suited and booted, with or without melee charity included. What stats are we looking for? Well, that's a question when it comes to Prot Paladin. Let me explain. Prot Paladins have a gear conundrum. There'll be times where you're evaluating your given role for a fight and entering the gear matrix of your bank and bags, trying to calculate what makes the most sense. Whilst many options will work, if you're min-maxing, there's just a lot to consider. First, avoidance and defense. If you're tanking something nasty, or dare I say main tanking raid bosses, you need to be uncrushable to make your damage intake stable before you consider your threat. Without rambling on too much, you need 102.4% total avoidance, which is our mischance from defense, parry, block and dodge added together to be uncrushable against a TBC raid boss, which is a lot given that we don't have something as OP as shield block to cheat up quite as high as warriors do. This means to tick this box, we are slacking on our threat stats initially. These threat stats are first and foremost spell damage, it is our bread and butter, then this is followed by spell hit, normal hit and expertise. But before I get into that, before we've considered avoidance and threat, there is a baseline that you need to have even if you're not main tanking raid bosses, and this is 490 defense, and this is essentially to prevent crits. So once again, if you're main tanking especially, Prot Paladins are distracted quite heavily from these threat stats, which we are typically quite interested in for blasting through PvE content as Chad-like as possible. If this is starting to sound a little bit like spinning plates, it honestly can be, especially early on. You can slack on avoidance if you're doing something like tanking a lot of small lads, but typically this remains a goal and ultimately becomes easier to mesh with our threat stats as the tiers progress. So with those defense aspects covered, spell damage is the bread and butter of the spec. If you hate being a ranged DPS but enjoy the idea of yoinking their weapons, look no further. You're all about that spell damage once you can take a beating. The other stats mentioned are nice to have, and you might be able to pick them up on your weapon or some jewelry, but that's very rare to get on Tankadin items, especially before the very end game. So realistically, for much of the expansion's life cycle, you'll probably have very little hit expertise, spell hit. However, this is not really a problem because of how well our threat scales with just spell damage. So we can afford to have some misses and resists because our threat is just benefited so much by raw spell damage that it's not as big a deal as, say, if you're DPSing as a warlock or a mage. Now we've established our career as a professional plate spinner, both in terms of stats and our spells. What does our playtime inside raids look like? First, let me clear the air on seals. I had written a long explanation that was ultimately just too long about how the seals work and what circumstances and what patches will mean you use different seals, but essentially this will vary depending on the patch used as the base for TBC Classic and potentially your weapon speed. So I'm not going to refer to any specific seal, just know that when I say threat seal, I'm referring to either Seal of Righteousness, Vengeance, or Blood, depending on whatever turns out to be the optimal choice on live servers and on what faction you are potentially as well. Fortunately, however, the seal used doesn't make a huge impact on what our general globals look like in a raid, so let's get into that. First, you're going to make sure that Righteous Fury is up at all times. My first 25-man raiding experience was trying to off-tank on Hiking Mulgar after forgetting that Righteous Fury wasn't up, and to cut the story short, it really wasn't pretty. So we start there. Whilst there are some particular openers, the general priority is to maintain Holy Shield uptime for periods of high damage. If damage is low, you can slack. With this considered, however, the next focus is to keep Exorcism on cooldown. A lot of the bosses are going to be demons. This also applies to Avenger's Shield. We want that on cooldown as well, but this will depend on mana and your damage intake because it has a cast time. Whilst also ensuring, alongside this, that we've got Judgment of the Crusader applied to buff our holy damage. This can be applied by a different Paladin though, and hopefully you've got someone in your raids that's Retribution who can do it for you. Once these things are on cooldown or applied to the boss, you're focusing on keeping Judgment of your threat seal kept on cooldown and maintaining your threat seal uptime once you've judged. So essentially you're going to go judge into seal typically. Finally, ensure consecration is up as often as the previous priority allows. It is a great threat spell, but it's generally going to be less optimal to miss a judgment, for example, as it is to delay consecration by one global. Finally, if damage is low, you can move your Holy Shield priority down to the bottom here, because essentially you're looking for threat where you're not taking huge damage, you just want to blast threat and damage, and as such Holy Shield moves to the bottom of this list and just fill it into an empty global that is spare from all the other spells, unless of course you're getting your ass eaten and therefore you need to use it as a top priority. With that said, let's briefly cover races before we move on, but sometimes it is very subjective, and in this case I believe it's super subjective, but let's just go over it. So it's pretty close if you ignore the seal stuff we touched on earlier. There is a small benefit to having Seal of Vengeance as Alliance over Seal of Righteousness for Horde, but it's not as big as, say, Seal of Blood is going to be for Retribution. Humans get a small threat boost with 5 expertise on the 2 weapon types you're typically going to equip as a Prot Paladin, maces and swords, whilst Dwarf has a pretty solid cooldown in stone form that at least provides 10% additional armor for 8 seconds for any sketch moments, but also has some niche utility such as removing Morris's bleed in Karazhan, which will actually be nice to have in the super early days where the bleed might actually be impactful. Draenei Paladins also provide 1% hit via Heroic Presence. However, if you are not the only Draenei Paladin, Warrior or Hunter in your group, then it is actually just completely dead. As such, this is going to be highly dependent on your raid comp and if you know what your red comp is before you make your character. For that reason, I wouldn't recommend Draenei. However, it is very strong in the right circumstances. If we get no huge changes, Alliance Paladins get Seal of Vengeance, which as mentioned is the best seal for threat in 2.4.3. However, we all know how good an AoE silence is if we've played retail for a prolonged period. It is very, very impactful, and because the seal thing is less important than it is for, say, Retribution, going Horde is also strong, especially if you plan to arena or play Ret as off-spec, because then you get Seal of Blood for sure. If I absolutely had to choose, regardless of faction, I would probably go for Dwarf in terms of pure min-maxing, but as an alt, I'd actually pivot towards the Blood Elf because the AoE silence for 5-mans is going to be really nice, and of course, we cannot discount Human entirely. 5-3 expertise might sound quite small, but expertise is at such a premium on gear that it is a little bit of a nice boost to our threat, but mind you, our melee hits and the seals that proc from them are going to be a good chunk of our threat, but not quite as impactful as, say, something like spell damage or even spell hit typically. With that said, it's pretty hard to differentiate significantly between these options. So, that's the basics covered on the Prot Paladin, but why would you want to play it? Well, first and foremost, it has exceptionally powerful niches beyond the capability of other tanks. Whilst you may not be the most optimal main tank, and in some cases may not be a good choice to main tank at all, the first niche is something you've probably already heard of, and that is that the AoE threat is literally bonkers and cannot be replicated by any other tank. This means you are literally hot shit in 5-mans for any encounter that has an annoying wave of ads to collect, such as Hydros in Serpent Shrine Cavern, or just Mount Hijau in its entirety as an annoying hellhole of many, many mobs. Also, due to being a tank that isn't using rage, you can chase threat very well as you have full control of your abilities compared to a bear or prot warrior that may encounter a few low rage moments in early raiding content, especially if they're off tanking. Whilst you may blow your load on mana potions to achieve this, you will be very effective at maintaining second threat and or pushing to main threat without taunt if you put your mind to it. For example, on Morrows for the gouge on the main tank, and especially in the case of Gurtog Bloodboil, where threat control is a real big deal. So this sounds good. What's the catch, bro? Well, we kind of touched on one in terms of the limitations earlier. Gearing is tough for the Prot Paladin. It takes more farming and more thinking to gear appropriately as a Prot Paladin for either threat, mitigation, or a mixture, and then later on gets a little bit easier. This will appeal to some of you. Some of you will love to look at different gear sets and min-max your way through the content, and that's great. But for some, it will be an annoyance, and it isn't until those later tiers with the higher stat budgets that you're able to sort of condense your gear sets into 1, 2, potentially 3 gear sets, typically. But before then, it may feel like you're spinning plates, or fishing for that one perfect Karazhan or heroic item that makes your gear set work ahead of the 25-man content. Even at the endgame, as mentioned, you're going to have a few gear sets that lean one way or the other, but to summarise, gear is essential for the Prot Paladin. One little tip before we leave this point is that if you're currently playing a Paladin, or have one as an alt in Classic, in the earlier stages of TBC gearing, you'll be very thankful to have Stylene's Impending Scarab from Blackwing Lair if you manage to get one before we transition to TBC. Outside of this, some people may find the playstyle a little slow at times, as there are sometimes a couple empty or empty feeling globals in the threat cycle that don't feel very meaty or impactful. This brings us to professions, and here there is a slight change. Whilst not Zuela State Television Service will always air the Supreme Leader in this designated segment of the broadcast, you may be surprised to know that dual crafting actually has a clear lead for Prot Paladins in that second profession slot. Not only does it provide the better gems that it does for other classes and specs, but Prot Paladin is probably the only spec that genuinely puts these serpentine figurines to good use. For context, many tanks will use Dark Mooncard Vengeance or the Goblin Rocket Launcher to get chunkier, but for the Tankadin, you will be happiest with a figurine and either of these. Also, you get a cute snack pet to watch you tank for the duration of the cooldown. But once again, if you deceive Big Brother, I mean your raid leader, and do not take leatherworking, your next best choice is typically enchanting for the 24 free spell power to your rings for more threat. This will be especially useful in the early days when you're spinning plates between defensive stats and threat stats. A notable mention, of course, as well, is engineering. The goggles are solid enough, but unspectacular. However, being Goblin Engineering does net you an early trinket that's really quite chunky and has a little bit of threat in the on use, and you can use both, or rather you can use two. It won't last you forever, but the tank trinkets in the game aren't so great across the board, and this is an easily accessible and strong trinket, assuming you're okay on avoidance. Now we're on to PvP. Just kidding, don't play Protection Paladin Arena if your sole objective is to push rating. No, really, don't do that. And as such, this brings us to the end of this Not Zuela State Television broadcast, and I will see you next time, hopefully in your notifications.